Thanks, Keith, and I'd like to begin by just thanking my fantastic all-woman team in the Commons, Shadow Transport team, Lillian Greenwood, Yvonne Favag, and my PPS Pat Glass here in the hall with us today. Conference, do you remember David Cameron's promise on rail fares last year, capping future increases at just 1% above inflation? But remember what actually happened. The New Year slog back to work. The first commute on a cold, dark January morning. But the nastiest shock awaiting commuters? Third year in a row of inflation-busting fare rises. Some tickets up by as much as 11%. David Cameron's broken promise on rail fares. And we all know why. Because David Cameron cannot and will not stand up to vested interests, because he will always put the privileged few before working people. We can't be one nation if we price more and more people off our transport system, when people can't afford to live near their job or have to travel further and further just to find one. It can't be right that the cost of commuting is going up so much faster than wages, often costing more than the mortgage or the rent. When we tell young people to stay in education or find an apprenticeship, it can't be right that they can't afford to actually get there. That's why a one-nation Labour government will tackle the cost of living crisis. As a first step, banning train companies from hiking fares beyond strict limits. No more averaging out the so-called fare cap, but an actual cap. Not on some routes, but on every route. And let me say this to the train companies. You make hundreds of millions a year in a system that pays out more in subsidies than you pay back to taxpayers. So when fares rise again in January, do the right thing. Voluntarily cap fare rises since ministers won't. Do your bit to ease the cost of living crisis. But if you choose not to act, then a one-nation Labour government will. You know, to be fair, ministers did actually announce a cap on rail fares last week. New maximum prices for singles and returns, and the new cap, £250 one way, £500 return. And that's not even first class. Conference, what planet is David Cameron on? It isn't just the level of fares that drives people to distraction. It's the feeling that the system is always trying to rip you off. You buy an off-peak ticket, but nowhere does it tell you when off-peak actually starts. And every train company seems to use a different set of rules. So yes, we need to cap fare rises, but we need a new deal for passengers too. No more stretching peak time when it's actually about stretching profits. No more confusing tickets so you get fleeced because you got the wrong train. Stick the exact times you can use a ticket on the ticket. And it's not difficult, really. No more inflexibility when you can't book in advance, so you can't get the next train, even when it's empty. And if you do have the wrong ticket on the train, take off the price you've already paid from the cost of a new one. No more single and return journeys costing the same, not just in one pilot area after 2015 as the government plans, but across the network. No more ticket machines that don't sell the cheapest fare. No more charging more at the ticket office than online for the same journey, just to provide another excuse to close them. No more using station parking charges as just another way to clobber commuters. No more ripping people off to get onto the internet just because they're not in first class. And isn't it time that all trains had Wi-Fi? You know, it's the 21st century. So let's require it in all future contracts. A new deal for passengers, backed up by a new legal right to be offered the cheapest fare, with refunds if you're not. Isn't it time to end the racket on our railways and once again put passengers before profit? So let's also tackle another racket. When train companies are paid £136 million by Network Rail for delays, it's wrong for them to pocket £100 million of it intended for passengers, driving up the cost of our railways. In future, it should go to passengers or back to taxpayers. And let's hear no more talk of David Cameron's plan for new super peak fares, meaning your season ticket won't even be valid on every train, despite the thousands of pounds that it cost. How out of touch to think everyone can pick and choose the hours that they work. Now, of course we have to tackle overcrowding on our railways, but not in a way that just adds to the cost of living. So let's free up space for new commuter services by moving the growth in longer journeys onto a new north-south rail line, reducing journey times, getting more freight off our roads. That's why we support High Speed 2. And unlike the Tories, we'll insist that building the new north-south rail line creates thousands of new apprenticeships for our young people. But, as Ed Balls has rightly said, there can be no blank cheque for any government project. So I say to David Cameron, get a grip on this project, get a grip on its budget, and get it back on track. And while you're at it, get a grip on the chaos in rail franchising too. You know, it's a year to the day today, since ministers had to cancel the competition to run Intercity West Coast. What an absolute shambles, entirely caused by ministerial incompetence. And what an appalling, unacceptable, scandalous waste of public money. £50 million of compensation to train companies, millions more to lawyers and consultants, the expense of 2 inquiries, and now ministers forced to extend rail contracts by up to 50 months. That's more than 4 years, while they sort out the mess. And how do you think the crack negotiating team of Patrick McLaughlin and Simon Burns are doing? Well, with just 2 out of 12 extensions agreed, the private train companies will pay a staggering £78 million less than last year, enough to have ended above inflation fare rises next year. Ministerial incompetence adding to the cost of living crisis. And now ministers have come up with a new plan to waste money, a costly and unnecessary privatisation of East Coast trains. Yet it's on track to have paid £800 million to the government, and it's reinvested all of its profits in the service, profits that from 2015 will be shared with shareholders if this plan goes ahead. Or will go back to the German, French or Dutch railways, keeping fares on the continent lower than our own. David Cameron, even at this late stage, abandon this costly, unnecessary, ideological, dogmatic, cynical, wrong-headed, vested interest-driven, disastrous privatisation. But if you do go ahead, end the nonsense that means the only rail company in the world barred from bidding is the one that's running it and doing it well. How completely bizarre that Tory ministers have no problem with a government-run rail service so long as it isn't British. So instead of all this waste, let's reduce costs in our railway, save money by bringing a fragmented industry together, Bring together responsibilities spread across the Transport Department, the Rail Delivery Group, directly operated rail and HS2 within a reformed and more accountable Network Rail. Save money by ending wasteful repainting and rebranding of trains and stations with every new contract. Restore a coherent identity to our national train services, regardless of public or private operator, not just reducing waste, but making life easier for passengers too. Our conference, local transport is adding to the cost of living crisis too. Bus fares rising by nearly twice the rate of inflation. Transport authorities powerless to act. Unable to insist that tickets work across operators. Unable to introduce smart ticketing like Oyster. Unable to cap the daily, weekly and monthly cost of travel. Unable to require bus companies to let young people travel free, and unable to take control of local rail services to create a genuinely integrated local transport network. All things taken for granted in London. But David Cameron's government is making it harder for councils to deliver change. His franchising fiasco has put the brakes on local control over rail. His decision to rig bus funding now penalises authorities that pursue reform. And I pay tribute to Labour councils and councillors that are determined to fight for a better deal for passengers. Like David Wood, the chair of Tyne and Wear Integrated Transport Authority, now with his colleagues pursuing the first ever quality bus contracts, leading the way, and others will follow, reversing the failure of bus deregulation, tackling the cost of living crisis. And a One Nation Labour government would make it easier, a simpler, faster route to reform, deregulation exemption zones, devolve funding to give transport authorities greater clout when they negotiate. Let me say this to those bus companies that are opposing reform. You already bid for contracts to run rail services. You already bid for contracts to run buses in London and across Europe. And you can do so in Tyne and Wear. You can do so wherever councils want to secure a better deal for taxpayers and fare payers. Conference. Nearly a quarter of the journeys we make are less than a mile. So here's another step we can take to tackle the cost of living crisis while improving our health and protecting our environment. Let's get Britain cycling. Now, on this issue, Norman Baker and I agree. He's tried to get his Tory bosses to take cycling seriously. But while they've set out a plan to spend £28 billion on roads, he's secured just £38 million a year to support cycling. And he's conveniently forgotten the 3 wasted years that followed his decision to axe Cycling England and its £60 million a year budget. Come off it, Norman, on your bike. So here's what we need to do. Clear goals to increase cycling, separated routes, redesigned junctions, phased traffic lights, cycling safety assessments for all new transport schemes, restored targets to cut road deaths and serious injuries, duties to support active travel, as Labour has introduced in Wales, 20-mile-an-hour zones, increasingly the default in residential areas, long-term support for teaching safe cycling, space on trains and secure facilities at stations required in rail contracts, sentencing guidelines reviewed, tough new safety rules on HGVs, supporting cycling, increasing numbers, improving safety, conference, practical measures to reduce the cost of living, capping rail fares, reforming ticketing, integrating transport, supporting cycling, new help for commuters, removing barriers facing young people, One Nation Labour, led by Ed Miliband, dealing with the cost of living crisis, reducing the pressure on household budgets, delivering a One Nation transport system that works for working people. Thank you very much.